The sound of polite laughter and the exchange of pleasantries wafted through the air. 4 violins played softly through Work by Vivaldi. A dozen men and women in tuxedos brought refreshments to the 100 guests that were sprinkled across the marble ballroom. Massive glass windows looked out over the moonlit beaches of Napoli. In the distance, the great volcano Vesuvius's silhouette was just barely visible against the starry sky. The mansion was a sprawling complex consisting of a half-dozen villas for guests and staff. The main building was surrounded on all sides by towering hedges. There was a cobbled drive that passed 2 sets of gates on its path to the front of the manor. In the center of the entrance, there was an artificial waterfall adorned with stone nymphs and goddesses. A flight of stairs was flanked on both sides by paved paths that descended under the mansion. If one was to follow those down, a massive garage could be found. Familiar favorites like VX Raptors and Dildego Grottas sat polished to perfection next to classic models from defunct manufacturers like Lamborghini and McLaren. At the top of the stairs, 2 massive wooden doors were surrounded by a hand-carved frame. The doors were carved with 2 Spartan soldiers standing guard, spear and shield in hand. Out of view, 3 dozen cameras, infrared and visual, watched the entrance to the compound. 126 more dotted the remainder of the 12-foot-high titanium-lined stone walls that sealed off the mansion from the Italian countryside. Beyond the great wooden doors was an enormous marble foyer that had 2 fountains flanking its central walkway. The fountains themselves were covered in cherubs and angels with soft smiling faces. At the far end of the room, 2 staircases curved gracefully towards a balcony that extended many feet further inward. White Corinthian columns framed the walkways. Frescoes and paintings hung silently along the walls of the great room. They watched over the party currently taking place. The man who was their owner stood near the center of the room. He was surrounded by a dozen perfectly dressed and immaculately well-groomed high-status individuals. The remainder of the room was much the same. Nearly everyone at this party were household names. Some were movie stars and celebrities, others were entrepreneurs or innovators. There were businessmen and artists, directors and writers. Mostly, however, there were politicians. The owner was of the latter sort. Senator Anders, one of the suits called. The man turned with a well-practiced smile to behold the new arrival. He noted that the crowd gathered was still laughing at his most recent joke. Senator Anders was very good with people. "Well," he spoke, "if it isn't William Price." The arrival smiled at the senator's recognition. "Remember a name and people will love you forever." Senator Anders quickly remembered everything he knew about William Price. The man was a staunch environmentalist with strongly progressive tendencies. He was a bleeding heart if Anders had ever seen one. Mr. Price nodded and then pointed to another man much younger and said, "Senator, this is Seth Kennedy. He's going to be hegemon someday." "Oh, I'm sure that it'll rain cow shit for a month before that'll happen," Senator Anders thought dryly. Anders turned to the younger man with a polite smile. "Any friend of Will's is a friend of mine. It's a pleasure to meet you, Seth." The senator noted that his circle of high-status individuals was beginning to fray. Soon, they would disperse throughout the party. "What a shame, I had another story for them." "It's an honor to meet you, Senator. I was a big fan of your healthcare and ethics bill," the young man named Kennedy said with all of the genuine enthusiasm that naivety could muster. "Please," Anders replied. "In my house, call me Quentin." The younger man nodded. His eyes were filled with a youthful passion. Quentin Anders was almost jealous. The crowd that had surrounded the senator finally broke and began to search for familiar faces, or food, or even alcohol. "You have a beautiful house, Senator," Seth said, disregarding the elder's offer to call him by his first name. "Smart boy, not too eager to cozy up to the tit of power. It makes you weak and submissive, and it's impossible to stop sucking once you've started." "Thank you very much," Anders responded, glancing around his massive ballroom. His eyes hung for a few seconds on an individual that stood halfway up one of the winding staircases. The senator felt a flash of nervousness and he looked back at the younger man, his smile quickly hiding any other emotions. I'm a man of rather extravagant tastes. I've just had the good fortune of having the ability to manifest those desires into reality. What is he doing here? How did he even get inside? Quentin wondered about the man that stood alone on the staircase. He was leaning over the railing, looking at the fountain, but Anders had no doubt who he was here to see. Might I be so bold as to ask, Senator? But would those have been cypress trees that I noticed lining your estate? Seth asked unabashedly. The senator's smile grew larger, real this time. Why yes, in fact they are. Would you like to see them up close? I have quite a nicely landscaped backyard, if I do say so myself. Quentin asked the younger one, suddenly feeling anxious to be out of the room. He could feel the man on the staircase's eyes upon him. Absolutely, sir, Seth Kennedy replied. William Price glanced back and forth between the two, awaiting an invitation. When none was offered, he attempted to save face. Well, you two get to that, Price said quickly, feigning a smile. I see Meryl Frey over there and I simply must tell her hello. The man bolted quickly, attempting without success to hide the look of dejection from his face. Well then, shall we? Quentin asked. After you, Senator. Seth responded with a quick grin. The older politician was taking a liking to this boy already. There was a hunger in his eyes. It was offset by innocence, to be sure, but that could be advantageous to a man with the right sort of abilities. Quentin Anders was a man with abilities. He led the younger man towards the other staircase. As he did, Quentin stole a quick glance towards the opposite side. The man was no longer there. That made the senator even more nervous. They ascended to the balcony side by side. Quentin noticed the way his new acquaintance eyed the senator's artwork. It was all extraordinarily expensive. The older man could almost hear the other's thoughts. How could he afford all of this? The senator asked himself. Of course, there were two answers to that question. The one he gave and the real one. Quentin Anders was the owner of 18,000 natural gas derricks. He had been since his 90th birthday when he had seized Anders oil from his distant relatives. Of course, no one knew that part. It just happened that the CEO and sole proprietor Zachary Anders had a heart attack in his sleep. 3 days later, his wife threw herself off of a bridge in her grief. With no other relatives, the company fell to him. The company's competition followed suit. For the next 3 decades, Quentin had cornered the better part of a dying market. Terrible, terrible tragedies. Anders felt the faintest hints of a smile on his face. Then, of course, there were the other sources of revenue. Those were a little bit more sensitive. You have a very refined taste, Senator. The young man broke the silence as they reached the top of the stairs. Seth Kennedy stared at the frescoes, his eyes were still wide with amazement. The senator followed his gaze. The fresco in question was called The Human. It was based off of a picture of a soldier standing upon a bluff. His burnt and dirty fatigues were torn in several areas. Only his back and helmet were visible. The slight hunch of his shoulders somehow conveyed a monumental exhaustion. He was one of the survivors of the Colombian conflict. The conflict that had united the world. The conflict that I set in motion. Quentin opened his mouth to respond, but a shadow cut him short. Senator Anders. A cool voice that Quentin knew all too well, spoke. What a pleasure. The politician turned to behold a man. Neither large nor small, the man's only striking feature were his eyes. They were completely flat. They were lifeless like a doll's eyes. Forcing a smile, the senator responded. Ah, hello, David. His nervousness was growing by the second, making it harder to construct a fabrication. If Kennedy noticed anything, he didn't express it. Might I have a word with you? The man asked in honeyed tones. Certainly. The senator's words sounded harsh and forced. Seth. He turned to the younger man. Would you await me on the terrace? It won't be long. I just need to catch up with an old friend. Seth nodded without a word. He nodded politely at the other man, who made no response. After a moment, Seth Kennedy turned and strolled away, admiring the hall's many paintings as he went. The senator desperately wished he could join him. "Walk with me, Quint," the man with the doll's eyes said. It was more an order than anything else. Quentin Anders suppressed his mixture of frustration and anxiety and simply nodded. He flashed a smile at the other man, there was no happiness behind it. "Sure, Martin, as you wish," he said, resuming his practiced charm. Together, the pair strolled away. The party sat behind them, forgotten. More important matters were at stake. To be continued. Author's name and the link to original text is in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video.